Okay, let's dive in. We had a listener get in touch asking about concerns over future big fiscal deficits, and they shared this really fascinating historical piece. It looks at China's fiscal policy way back, starting in 1979. So that's our guide today.
Yeah, and the source uses this core analogy throughout, which I think is really helpful. It calls it face plus water, water plus face.
Right, that constant back and forth, adding water if there's too much flour, adding flour if there's too much water, always adjusting.
Exactly. Trying to manage supply and demand, deficits, inflation.
Mm.
The source basically says that struggle, that adjustment, is the main story of the last 40 plus years.
Mm-hmm. And understanding that history, well, it feels crucial, doesn't it? It shows us how China actually dealt with some massive economic bumps and fiscal pressures in the past.
It does. You see the different tools they reached for, the policy choices, and importantly, the consequences. Looking back gives us context for, what might be happening now or next.
So that's our mission for this deep dive then. To walk through this history, step by step, policy by policy, using this review as our map, we want to really get a feel for how the approach evolved and what the source pulls out as the key lessons.
And it's worth noting the author says up front, look, they're not claiming to be some kind of formal fiscal policy guru.
Right.
It's more like they've compiled the historical record, and they're offering insights based on experience, even, they say, being personally involved in some of these events.
Which gives it a pretty unique flavor, I think. Part analysis, part almost eyewitness account.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, great. So let's really dig into this history then, starting right back at the beginning, 1979.
Okay, 1979.
So set the scene for us. Reform and opening up has literally just started. The economy's waking up, which is good, but signs of overheating are already there.
Right. You got deficits appearing, inflation picking up, driven by both investment and consumption demand, apparently, and the trade imbalance starting to brew.
So quite a mix. And this is the context for Zhao Ziyang's policy at the time. Adjustment, reform, rectification, improvement. A bit of a mouthful.
It is. And the really big fiscal reform that comes out of this period is what the source calls eating in separate kitchens.
Eating in separate kitchens. Okay, what does that mean in practice?
Well, think about the old system. Before this, it was basically eschew, unified revenue collection, unified expenditure. Everything went to the center. Everything came from the center.
Okay.
This reform broke that. It divided up the responsibilities for raising money and spending money between the central government and the local governments, gave them their own kitchens.
Ah, right. So they're responsible for their own patch, fiscally speaking.
Sort of. It was often on a fixed basis,
Yeah.
contractual arrangements. The source mentions that big cities like Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai had slightly different deals compared to other provinces.
And the source draws a direct line from this reform to something we still talk about today, right? The sort of princely economies.
It does.
Hmm.
The argument is that by giving local governments control over their own revenue streams, you created this powerful incentive for them to, well, maximize their own income, become these little economic kingdoms almost.
That's a huge shift in incentives right at the start. Wow.
Absolutely fundamental. And alongside that big structural change, there were some very concrete tightening measures. They really squeezed infrastructure investment.
How'd they do that?
The Ministry of Finance put out a notice, basically telling everyone, stick to the budget, follow the plan, don't run up debts, discipline.
Okay.
But apparently, this is also when provinces got creative. The source mentions the invention of fishing projects.
Fishing projects. I like the sound of that. What is it?
Well, the idea is you get a project approved with a relatively small initial budget, you get it started, but then, oh dear, unforeseen circumstances. You need a lot more money to finish it. You've essentially hooked the central government into funding the rest.
Sneaky. And the source says some of those techniques are still around.
Apparently so.
Yeah.
They also mention halting or delaying big imported projects, unfinished ones, non-productive ones. And interestingly, they started experimenting with charging interest on capital construction funds, which kind of planted a seed for later reforms.
So investment was squeezed. What about consumption?
That too. They used planned management and quotas for what they called social group purchasing power, basically, official spending by government units and institutions.
Ah.
The source says these controls were like grain coupons, but for goods. Sometimes harder to get the quota than the actual cash.
Wow, I bet some older listeners remember that feeling.
I bet. They also put institutions on a lump sum budget system and really tried to crack down on those year-end spending sprees, use it or lose it.
Right, the classic bureaucratic rush. Okay, so tightening on investment, tightening on consumption. What about the supply side?
Yeah, they did try to boost supply in targeted areas, especially agriculture and light industry. The source gives some figures like 17.4 billion yuan for agricultural funds in 79, 15 billion in 80.
So significant amounts.
And they bumped up the prices the state paid for grain, especially for above quota amounts, by quite a bit. 20% increase, and the premium went from 30% to 50%.
Trying to incentivize farmers.
Exactly, though the source adds a note of caution.
Mm.
Some of the rushed investment into light industry apparently resulted in what they call rotten enterprises, badly planned ventures that didn't really work out.
Okay, so not all successes. And anything else.
They also tried to control exports that were heavily subsidized to reduce the drain on the treasury from foreign trade losses.
Got it. So what was the immediate result of all this adjustment and tightening?
Well, according to the source, economic growth slowed down quite noticeably. It apparently dropped from 7.8% in 1980 down to 5.2% in 1981.
Okay, so the brakes definitely work.
They did. And the author actually slips in a comment there sort of questioning Zhao Ziyang's economic management skills at that point based on this outcome.
Interesting. So looking back at this early phase, why is it important for understanding the bigger picture?
I think it shows those very first tentative steps in trying to actively manage the economy after the planned era, dealing with those classic problems, overheating, deficits.
Right.
And crucially, it's the start of that decentralization trend, moving away from the fully centralized model. It's set of dynamics between the center and the localities that, well, are still very much with us today.
Okay, makes sense. So that tightening in 79, 81 slowed things down. But then what happened? Did new problems emerge?
They did. By 1982, the pendulum swung back. The economy had cooled, maybe too much, and a big issue was rising unemployment.
Ah, okay. Social pressure.
Exactly. The source mentions it was really tough to find jobs, and there were apparently protests by educated youth who had returned to the cities and couldn't find work. That created pressure to loosen things up.
So what did they do?
Well, there was a forced relaxation of credit controls. But the really big move, what the source calls the start of true fiscal reform, was profit retention substituted by tax payment.
Okay. What's the core idea there?
It's fundamental. Yeah. Before this, the state basically took almost all the surplus value generated by state-owned enterprises.
Right.
This reform said no. After you pay your taxes, the enterprise gets to keep a significant portion of the profit.
Wow. Okay, that sounds like a huge deal.
The source treats it as immense, revolutionary almost. They argue it meant workers weren't just cogs in the machine anymore. They, through the enterprise, had a claim on some of the value they created.
That's a profound shift in thinking.
It is. The author makes this bold comparison to Shangyang's reforms in ancient China,
Whoa, okay.
arguing it shifted the system away from pure state ownership towards something more like an employment relationship with elements of rent, turning workers from, and this is the source's dramatic phrasing, slaves into free men.
That is dramatic.
Yeah.
But it highlights the perceived significance. So what was the economic effect?
According to the source, an explosion of energy. It unleashed this immense energy and motivation for pursuing wealth. And this led directly to what they call mad growth. The numbers show it. GDP growth jumped back up 9.1% in 82, then 10.9% in 83.
So you flick the switch on incentives and boom.
Pretty much. This period, for the source, is where you really see the ignition of that dynamism, that growth engine that defined China for so long. It's a powerful illustration of how changing the rules of the game can unlock economic potential.
Makes sense. Okay, so 82 sees this release of energy. Let's jump forward a bit now to the late 1980s. Did the pattern repeat?
You guessed it. Starting around 1984, those familiar overheating symptoms reappeared. The gap between demand and supply widened. Investment and consumption grew rapidly. Prices started taking off again.
And deficits.
Widening deficits, yes, which the source links directly to the banks having to print more money, just adding fuel to the inflationary fire.
How bad did inflation get?
The source is very blunt. Official figures were around 25%, they say, but the actual rate people experienced was probably over 35%.
Wow, that's serious.
Extremely serious. And the source explicitly states this runaway inflation was the critical backdrop for the government's attempt at a price breakthrough.
Price breakthrough, what was that?
Basically an attempt to liberalize prices. But the source describes it as a desperate gamble, a path of no return that ultimately failed and resulted in what they term a national tragedy. We're just reporting the source's view here, of course.
Understood. So, faced with this crisis, high inflation, the fallout from the price reform attempt, what did policymakers do? This is around September 1988.
Correct. From September '88, they launched a new policy package, improve the economic environment, rectify the economic order, and comprehensively deepen reforms. The core of it was a double-tight policy, slamming the brakes on both fiscal and credit levers at the same time.
Double tight. Okay, so what did that look like on the ground?
Pretty harsh measures, according to the source. They halted or delayed a huge number of fixed asset investment projects, over 1,800 between late '88 and early '89.
Wow.
The focus was particularly on projects funded outside the main budget, and especially non-productive ones. Fancy office buildings, guest houses, halls. The source uses the shorthand THUR.
Right, the sort of prestige projects.
Exactly. But the source adds this really striking detail. It wasn't just those. Apparently, even some major scientific research and military projects got paused. They specifically mention a nuclear submarine project at the Systems Institute.
A nuclear submarine project. That shows how serious they were.
It does. And the source claims this abrupt halt led to a lot of hidden unemployment and significant public anger. People suddenly out of work on these big projects.
Yeah, I can imagine. What else did the tightening involve? Did it affect people's daily lives?
Oh, definitely. The source says measures were taken that directly aimed at lowering living standards, essentially. The number of goods that required special quotas or coupons to buy expanded from 19 items up to 32.
So more rationing, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. Bonuses in state-owned enterprises were effectively frozen nationwide. The criteria for getting approval were apparently so strict that it was almost impossible.
Ouch.
And they jacked up savings interest rates dramatically, like over 10% for a one-year deposit, trying to suck money out of circulation.
Yeah.
Even buying durable goods often required those hard-to-get quotas or coupons.
The source shares an anecdote about that, doesn't it? About prices.
It does, a poignant one about older workers being really upset about food prices shooting up. Sweet potatoes apparently went from 0.2 yuan per gen to 1 yuan per gen.
A five-fold increase.
Yeah, and it highlights how tough it was even for officials. A university graduate's monthly salary might be 136 yuan.
Yeah.
But black market pork could be over 3 yuan a gen. Do the math, that salary doesn't go very far at all.
Really puts it in perspective. What about fiscal measures targeting businesses or government itself?
Big ones. They cut off subsidies to state-owned enterprises, SOEs, that were making losses long-term. Smaller loss-making SOEs were just closed down or merged.
That must have hit certain regions hard.
The source explicitly calls this the beginning of the tragedy for Northeast state-owned enterprises and argues it created problems that Zhu Rongji later had to deal with, quite forcefully.
Right.
Administrative costs within the government were also slashed drastically. The source says they fell from over 42% of fiscal spending down to just 7.3% by 1990, describing that level as pathological and saying they left no stone unturned in cutting costs.
Pathological, wow.
Yeah. They even mentioned there was serious discussion at the time about potentially closing the prestigious Chinese Academy of Sciences to save money.
Closing the Academy of Sciences, that's drastic.
Shows the mood. And another really significant move. They postponed repayment on Treasury bonds that had been issued between 1981 and 1984, pushed it back 3 years.
So the government delayed paying its debts.
Essentially, yes. The source calls it the first time the central government defaulted on its debt, and adds, rather ominously, that it certainly wasn't the last time.
Yikes. Were there any reforms mixed in with all this tightening?
Yes. Some tax reforms continued. There was a pilot program in Chongqing linking tax and profit distribution more closely, trying to make enterprises responsible for repaying loans after they'd paid tax. And new taxes and different rates were introduced to try and discourage non-productive investments.
Okay, so a really intense mix of policies. What does the source say were the overall consequences of this double tight period?
The summary is pretty grim. Severe capital shortages for businesses, leading to production halts and shutdowns, a sharp drop in economic growth,
Okay.
a massive increase in hidden unemployment, as we mentioned, falling incomes for many people, a worsening fiscal situation for the government despite the cuts, and, critically, rising social instability.
And the source makes a direct link here, doesn't it?
It does. The source explicitly connects these harsh economic conditions and the resulting social instability directly to the political events of June 4th, 1989. Again, we're just relaying the connection made in the source material.
Understood. So this late 80s period, it sounds like a really stark example of how aggressive economic tightening, especially when hitting an already stressed system, can have incredibly severe consequences, spilling over into social and political realms.
Exactly. It's a powerful and sobering part of the story.
Okay, so that brings us to the early 1990s. Coming out of that really difficult period, that downturn and crisis, what was the mood? What was the policy direction?
Well, there was clearly a need to stabilize things, regain momentum, maybe reassert legitimacy. Deng Xiaoping's Southern tour in 1992 is often seen as the catalyst here,
Right, the famous Southern tour.
and the 14th Party Congress. The source describes this as providing an east wind, a push for renewed reform and opening. But guess what happened?
Let me guess, overheating.
You got it. The economy took off again, but very quickly ran too hot. By 1993, inflation was apparently roaring back, hitting 25%.
25% again, wow.
The source even includes this quote from a banker at the time, sounding quite desperate. National affairs are beyond help. Captures the sense of maybe losing control again.
So, facing another bout of serious overheating, what was the response this time?
This led to a new round of macro control measures starting in 93. But the really central piece, the landmark reform of this era, was the fiscal division reform, implemented in 1994.
Okay, we hear about this one a lot. What did it actually do?
It fundamentally restructured how money flowed between the central government and local governments. It did three main things.
Okay.
One, it clearly divided different types of taxes. Some went only to the center, some only to the locality, and some were shared according to specific formulas.
Got it. Clearer buckets.
Two, it separated the collection of taxes from the management of budgets. So you had distinct central and local tax collection agencies being set up.
Right.
And three, it established a formal system of transfer payments from the center back down to the localities, especially to poorer regions, to try and even things out a bit.
Okay, so what was the main goal behind this big restructuring?
Pretty clearly, it was about strengthening the central government's fiscal position and its ability to conduct macro control. Before this reform, the center's share of total national revenue had apparently shrunk to around 22%.
Only 22%. That seems low.
Very low compared to most other countries, the source notes. It limited Beijing's ability to, steer the ship or respond to regional disparities. This reform was designed to boost the center's share and control.
Did it work? Did the center get more revenue?
It did increase the center's share significantly, but the source immediately points out the local government reaction.
The countermeasures. Always countermeasures.
Always. Local governments responded by massively increasing their reliance on things outside the formal tax system, various fees, levies, and especially income from land sales and road tolls, finding ways to keep revenue streams under their own control.
The famous land finance model really takes off here then.
Exactly. This is a key moment for that. Alongside this big reform, there were other tightening measures too. They formalized rules about how enterprises distributed profits after tax. And they put strict controls on investment, again, cleaning up existing projects, limiting new ones.
Sounds familiar.
It is. And the source mentions efforts to really strengthen tax collection, crack down on evasion, and clean up unauthorized local tax breaks. It quotes someone describing Zhu Rongji's methods during this period as thunderous. Thunderous suggests a very forceful implementation.
Thunderous. Okay. So what was the verdict on this period's policies, according to the source? Successful.
Yes, the source portrays this as a success story. They describe the outcome as a soft landing, achieved by 1996.
The soft landing, the holy grail of macroeconomics.
Right. They managed to bring down inflation and cool the overheating, but without crashing the economy. Growth remained pretty strong. So it's presented as a successful example of macro control, achieving that desirable state of high growth, low inflation.
So this fiscal division reform, it feels like a really pivotal moment. It reshapes that core central-local financial relationship.
Absolutely foundational. The basic architecture set up in 1994, with subsequent tweaks, of course, is still largely the framework China operates under today. It shows how you can use major policy design to try and rebalance power and improve macroeconomic management capacity.
Okay, clear. Now let's shift gears again. What happens next? We're heading towards the late 90s.
And the next major shock, the Asian financial crisis. It really hit the region hard, starting around July 2nd, 1997.
Right, I remember that. How did it impact China?
The source says it was a severe blow. Foreign trade took a big hit as demand from neighboring countries collapsed. And China had its own internal structural issues, overcapacity in some industries, regional imbalances that apparently amplified the shock. It led to widespread factory closures and significant unemployment pressure.
So, an external crisis triggering internal problems. How did policymakers respond this time? Tightening again.
Actually, the opposite. Faced with collapsing external demand, the policy shifted dramatically in July 1998 towards what the source calls proactive fiscal policy,
Proactive fiscal policy, meaning.
meaning actively using government spending and tax policy to stimulate domestic demand and prop up the economy. Expansionary policy.
Okay, so how did they stimulate demand? What were the main tools?
The absolute main weapon was a massive issuance of government bonds, treasury bonds specifically earmarked for infrastructure investment.
Ah, infrastructure spending, a classic stimulus tool. How massive are we talking?
Huge scale. The source gives figures. 100 billion yuan worth in 1998 alone, another 270 billion just in the first half of 1999. By 2004, the total amount issued under this program was apparently 910 billion yuan.
Wow, nearly a trillion yuan.
And the source estimates this government spending leveraged over 2 trillion yuan in additional investment from banks and other sources, so a massive injection of capital.
Where did all that money go? What kind of infrastructure?
The list is pretty broad. Agriculture, water conservation projects, transportation roads, railways, urban infrastructure, upgrading the power grid, building state grain silos, really foundational stuff.
Okay, massive infrastructure push funded by bonds. What else was part of this proactive policy? Tax changes.
Yes, significant tax adjustments. To support struggling exporters, they increased export tax rebates pretty much across the board.
Makes sense. Counteracting the fall in foreign demand.
Right. They also adjusted import taxes and tariffs, offering exemptions for imported equipment used in projects the government wanted to encourage, aiming to keep attracting foreign investment.
Okay.
They reduced and eventually suspended a tax specifically aimed at guiding investment direction. And they introduced tax credits for companies buying domestically produced equipment, trying to boost local manufacturers.
Any changes related to property or individuals?
Yes, some adjustments to real estate taxes, like extending a business tax exemption for people reselling houses. And interestingly, they reintroduced a personal income tax on the interest earned from savings deposits, trying to nudge people to spend rather than save, perhaps.
Okay, so bonds for infrastructure, tax tweaks for trade and investment. What about directly boosting consumption?
They did that too. Government spending on public services increased. The source notes education share of the central budget rose for 5 years running.
Okay.
There was direct financial support provided for laid-off workers. 14.4 billion yuan is mentioned for that. They increased transfer payments to help provinces implement pension reforms and expand coverage.
And what about public sector wages?
Big increases there, too. The source mentions 3 consecutive wage hikes for government officials and staff in public institutions between 1999 and 2002. Apparently, basic salaries effectively doubled, plus bonuses were added. They also increased transfers to central and western regions, specifically to help pay salaries and fund minimum living allowances.
So, trying to put money directly into people's pockets, especially public sector workers. Anything else happening around SOEs during this period?
Yes, this was also when a large-scale process of SOE bankruptcy and restructuring really got going. The source mentions central government subsidies of nearly 13 billion yuan in 2002, just to help resettle over 380,000 workers laid off from closed state firms.
A huge number of people affected.
Massive social dislocation. At the same time, they were consolidating and creating large, centrally controlled enterprise groups, the big national champions in key sectors like electricity, telecoms, oil, automobiles. And these giants received significant support, like tax rebates and funding.
Okay. And trying to ease burdens on other businesses, too.
Yeah, they made efforts to reduce the burden on enterprises by canceling various illegal or unreasonable fees that local authorities might have imposed.
Got it. Now, there was one other major and quite controversial policy introduced during this time, wasn't there? The debt swaps.
Ah, yes. The debt-to-equity swaps tag. Highly controversial, and the source author has some incredibly strong feelings about this one.
Okay, explain the basic idea first. What was it supposed to do?
The idea was banks were saddled with huge amounts of bad debt owed by struggling SOEs. So the government set up special asset management companies, AMCs. These AMCs would take over the bad debt from the banks and then convert that debt into equity ownership shares in the struggling SOE.
So the bank gets the bad loan off its books, and the SOE gets its debt reduced, replaced by the AMC as a shareholder. Sounds plausible in theory.
In theory, maybe.
Yeah.
But the author's perspective, as presented in the source, is scathing. They describe their personal experience with this as causing pain etched into the bones.
Wow. Strong words. Why such a negative view?
The author argues it was fundamentally useless and incredibly costly for the state. They say billions were spent, but it ultimately left ruins. Their core argument is that it didn't address the real problems plaguing these SOEs, which were things like technological backwardness, a lack of capable management, poor incentive structures. The author likens the debt for equity swap to using cold medicine to treat liver cirrhosis, just treating a symptom, not the underlying disease.
That's a harsh analogy.
It is. They go further, calling the policy a killing weapon that actually harmed many enterprises that might have otherwise survived and hurt their workers in the process.
A killing weapon. How so?
The author strongly implies that power rent-seeking played a big role politically connected people benefiting from the process. And critically, they argue that a major mistake was preventing the financial institutions, the AMCs, who now held the equity, from actually getting involved in managing the enterprises. So the bad management often just continued.
Ah, so the ownership changed, but the operational problems weren't fixed.
That's the core critique. It looked like a solution on paper, but in practice, according to this source, it failed to be about real reform in the companies and became a tool for other agendas.
Okay, so a very critical take on that specific policy. But looking at the overall proactive fiscal policy period from 98 to maybe 2002, what's the source's summary of its impact?
Despite the sharp criticism of the debt swaps, the source does conclude that the overall package did achieve its main goals. It successfully mitigated the worst impacts of the Asian financial crisis on China.
Okay.
It helped curb deflationary pressures, supported a recovery in demand, and kept the economy growing during a very difficult external environment.
So a mixed bag in a way. Overall success and stabilization, but with specific policies that the source views as deeply flawed and painful.
That seems to be the takeaway. It showcases the government's ability to mount a massive state-led intervention to counter a crisis, using a whole range of fiscal tools. But it also highlights the potential for controversy and significant negative consequences depending on how those tools are implemented.
Right, okay, so that proactive phase helps China weather the Asian crisis. What happens as we move into the early 2000s? Does the pattern?
Oh, you know it. By 2003, the familiar signs were back. Overheating, investment levels were huge again, driven partly by that stimulus, lots of excess liquidity sloshing around the system.
Putting strain on resources.
Exactly. The source mentions strain on power supplies, coal, transportation bottlenecks appearing, and inflation was starting to tick up again. The roller coaster was heading up.
So, time for the brakes again. Who was in charge now?
When Jiabao's government came in, and implementing a prudent fiscal policy was identified as a key task for 2004, a shift away from proactive stimulus towards caution.
Prudent fiscal policy. Okay, what did that involve? How did they try to cool things down?
They took some steps. They reduced the planned amount of treasury bonds to be issued in 2004 by about 30 billion yuan compared to the previous year. They also tried to slow down spending on government-funded construction projects.
Did it work this time?
Well, the source notes that capital construction spending did fall slightly in the first part of 2004, down 11% year on year. But their overall verdict is pretty blunt. This attempt to cool down failed.
Failed again. Why? Was the momentum just too strong?
Perhaps. The economy seemed to have a lot of underlying steam. But the policy wasn't just about cooling down. They adopted what the source calls a support and restriction approach.
Support and restriction, meaning?
Meaning, while they tried to tap the brakes on overall investment, they simultaneously channeled strong support towards specific areas. Agriculture was a huge focus.
Ah, okay. What kind of support for agriculture?
Direct subsidies to grain farmers, subsidies for buying improved seeds and larger agricultural machinery. And the really big one, starting the process of reducing and then completely eliminating the agricultural tax.
Eliminating the agricultural tax, that's been around for millennia, hasn't it?
Pretty much. A huge symbolic and practical change. The source notes the tax exemption eventually covered 28 provinces, benefiting hundreds of millions of farmers.
Wow. Okay, massive support for agriculture. What else was supported?
Social spending got a big boost, too. Areas like employment support, social security, education, science, culture, public health. The source gives figures for the first half of 2004 showing significant growth rates here, like Social Security spending up 11.5%, education up nearly 17%.
So, trying to rebalance maybe? Less focus purely on investment, more on agriculture and social welfare.
That seems to be the direction. But tax reforms were also continuing at pace during this period.
Like what? besides abolishing the agricultural tax?
They piloted a major VAT reform in the Northeast starting in 2004. This was the shift from a production-based VAT, where companies couldn't deduct the tax paid on machinery purchases, to a consumption-based one where they could, a big boost for investment incentives, ironically.
Interesting. Anything else?
Personal income tax thresholds were raised a couple of times,
Hmm.
effectively giving people a tax cut. The corporate income tax system was unified in 2007-2008, putting domestic and foreign firms on a more equal footing. They adjusted resource taxes and consumption taxes. And there were constant tweaks to export tax rebates and import tariffs, often reducing rebates for things like high-energy consuming or polluting products, trying to steer the export structure.
So a lot of different levers being pulled on the tax front. Any other sectors getting special attention?
Yes, the source explicitly notes that this period saw strong policy support being introduced for the real estate sector.
Ah, okay. Through what kind of policies?
Tax adjustments, changes to land policies, tweaks to housing provident fund rules, basically laying the groundwork for the real estate boom.
Got it. So despite the talk of prudent policy and attempts to cool down, there were still these strong growth drivers: VAT reform boosting investment, support for real estate. What was the overall economic picture?
According to the source, the national macroeconomy just continued its roller coaster ride.
Yeah.
Still volatile, still prone to overheating despite the policy adjustments.
So this period shows continued adaptation, right? Big structural changes like getting rid of the agricultural tax, boosting social spending, but still wrestling with managing investment cycles and dealing with the rise of new forces like the property market.
Exactly. It's a picture of constant adjustment, trying to balance multiple objectives in a rapidly evolving economy without necessarily finding a stable equilibrium.
Okay, that takes us through the main chronological phases covered in the source, but the author also shares some broader reflections and insights, especially in a Q&A section, right?
Yes, they do. Stepping back from the specific policies, they offer some interesting, sometimes quite provocative takes on the nature of China's economy and governance.
What are some of those key themes?
Well, one recurring idea is the uniqueness of China's system. The author describes it not as a simple unitary state, but as a political unity with multiple economic entities, almost like a de facto federal system in economic terms.
Yeah, and that makes it different.
They argue it makes applying standard Western economic theories tricky. Things work differently on the ground. This ties into another theme: pragmatism, often bordering on reactive policy.
How do they describe that?
They use various phrases.
Yeah.
Crossing the river by feeling the stones,
Mm-hmm.
which is famous, but also cacking mice, meaning just do what works regardless of ideology, and treating the head when the head hurts, fares.
So focusing on fixing immediate problems rather than addressing deeper systemic issues sometimes.
That's the implication. Just react to the current pressure point.
What about their view on local governments? We talked about the princely economies.
Yeah, the author has a very colorful, almost cynical view of local government finance. They call it a black hole, where getting reliable data is incredibly difficult.
A black hole.
Yeah. They share anecdotes suggesting data manipulation is common, like provinces in the South may be underreporting revenue to keep more locally, setting an ambush, while some northern ones might overreport to look good. See? Shouting loudly.
Fascinating dynamics.
They also point out huge disparities, like some county officials getting big signing bonuses for projects, while others in poorer areas might struggle to afford tea for their office. It's a very uneven picture.
But it's not all negative, is it?
No. Despite the critiques, the author also expresses a kind of grudging admiration, maybe optimism, about the sheer energy and pragmatism they see at the local level, that grassroots vitality.
Okay. What about policy consistency? Is that a theme?
Yes, the lack of it sometimes. The source uses the vivid phrase, flipping the pancake,
Yeah.
to describe how policies can seem to reverse course abruptly.
Flipping the pancake, I like that.
And they connect this policy volatility to the generally higher level of economic volatility China has experienced compared to more developed economies. They mention things like M2 money supply growing at 30% at one point. It's just too scary.
Right. Now, you mentioned the debt-to-equity swaps earlier and the author's strong feelings. Do they elaborate more on why they felt it failed so badly?
Yes, they go into more operational detail in the reflections. They really hammer the point that the AMCs, the entities holding the equity, were generally not allowed to actively intervene in the management of the companies.
Which seems counterintuitive if the goal was reform.
Exactly. The author sees this as a critical flaw, allowing existing bad management and practices to continue. They also strongly reiterate the belief that power dynamics and rent-seeking behavior influenced which companies got swaps and how the process unfolded, rather than purely economic logic. That's why they stick to that harsh killing weapon description for its effect on some potentially viable firms.
Okay, a really deep critique there. Does the source touch on other complex, perhaps unintended consequences of development?
It does briefly mention environmental issues as systemic problems. For example, the impact of the Three Gorges Dam on downstream lakes like Poyang and Dongping,
What kind of impact?
causing lake water levels to drop significantly, leading to issues like sandification and ecological damage.
Hmm.
The author highlights this as a really tough problem because it involves multiple complex systems, water management, environment, local economies, all interacting. It's not an easy fix.
Right, those interconnected challenges. What about social stability? Given the ups and downs, the layoffs, how does the author view protests or group events?
Interestingly, their perspective, based on their experience, is that the threat posed by these events is often overestimated by outside observers.
Really? How so?
They don't dismiss them, but they argue these incidents are more like tiles falling off a building, messy, problematic, needing attention, but not usually representing a fundamental threat to the stability of the entire structure, the core state power.
That's a different perspective than you often hear.
It is. Now, related to state power, the author makes a very strong assertion about the relationship between the party and the market in China.
That's their take.
Absolutely unequivocal. The party, referring to the CCP or TG as shorthand, sometimes used in the source, is fundamentally in charge, not the market. They argue it's naive to think market forces are the ultimate decider in China.
The party is always the boss.
That's the message. They cite historical examples where the party has stepped in to curb or discipline powerful financial figures or market trends when deemed necessary. The political logic overrides the economic logic when push comes to shove, in their view.
Okay, a very clear statement on power dynamics. Does the author reflect on the human cost of all these reforms and volatility?
Yes, very much so. They repeatedly acknowledge the suffering involved, particularly for the millions of SOE workers laid off during the restructuring periods. They use that phrase, "have bone deep pain," to describe it.
But they also try to understand the policymaker's perspective.
They do. While critical of some methods, they try to grapple with the incredibly difficult choices leaders faced. They offer an assessment of someone like Zhu Rongji, crediting him with successfully organizing China's financial system and navigating crises, but acknowledging the immense social cost and musing whether it had to be quite so harsh.
A complex legacy.
Very. And despite highlighting all these problems, the volatility, the local debt issues, the environmental costs, the human pain, the policy mistakes. What's the author's final outlook?
Is it pessimistic?
Surprisingly, no. The underlying tone, especially towards the end, is one of long-term optimism,
Optimism. Based on what?
based fundamentally on a belief in the resilience and energy of the Chinese people and the pragmatic dynamism of local officials. A sense that, despite all the flaws and challenges, the system and the society have an inherent drive to adapt, solve problems, and keep moving forward. They express confidence that China will ultimately succeed and prove the pessimists wrong.
An optimistic conclusion after detailing such a turbulent history.
Okay,
That was quite a journey through China's fiscal past, wasn't it?
it really was. From 1979 right up through the mid-2000s, guided by this source, we've seen those repeating cycles: overheating, tightening, loosening, reform.
Yeah, and the sheer variety of policy tools they used. Big structural changes like eating in separate kitchens or the '94 fiscal division. Massive stimulus through infrastructure bonds. Controversial moves like the debt-to-equity swaps.
It paints a picture of, well, constant experimentation and adaptation, trying to manage this enormous, fast-changing economy. And it really underscores the complexity, the balancing act between growth, stability, inflation control, social fairness, all those competing pressures.
And for you listening, this history isn't just, old news. It genuinely forged the economic structures and the dynamics that are still shaping China today. Understanding these roots, the decentralization, the central-local tensions, the reliance on investment, the response to crises, it helps make sense of current events.
Absolutely. And it helps understand the potential challenges ahead, like the listener's original question about future deficits. How might China handle those pressures, given this history?
It also really forces you to think about the trade-offs, doesn't it? Every major policy choice discussed here had winners and losers, intended outcomes and unintended consequences, often with very real, sometimes painful, human impacts.
Definitely. No easy answers in managing an economy like this.
So maybe we can leave you with that final thought from the source to chew on. They paint this picture of a roller coaster ride. They highlight serious problems, local debt, black holes, environmental impacts, social costs, policy flip-flopping, and yet,
And yet they end on this note of underlying optimism, a belief in China's resilience, its local dynamism, the people's aspirations, allowing it to navigate whatever comes next.
so the question for you is, does that optimism feel warranted based on this history? Or does the pattern we've traced, that relentless face plus water, water plus face cycle, suggest that future challenges will just be the next iteration, perhaps even on a grander scale?
Something to think about as you continue your own deep dives.